Joe Cox, MP for Batley and Spenborough, was attacked in Market Street, Birstall. I am now very sad to have to report that she has died as a result of her injuries.
With ethnocentric nationalism on the rise, are we witnessing a radicalization in cyberspace?
The first time since the Second World War, we have a domestic prescribed terrorist group. It's right-wing, it's neo-Nazi, it's proudly white supremacist, portraying a violent and sort of wicked ideology.
Let's take a look.
Break it down!
In 2016, in the heat of the Brexit vote, MP for Birstall, Joe Cox, was murdered by a white supremacist on the very same day that Nigel Farage had released a poster of migrants queuing somewhere with the words "breaking point." When she was murdered, there was like genuine heartfelt and an emotion around the time, and also there was a call to cancel the Brexit vote, but Brexit vote still went ahead.
If the predictions now are right, this will be a victory for real people, a victory for ordinary people, a victory for decent people.
We all know how that went. But in the aftermath of the Brexit vote and the investigation into her death, you know, a lot of evidence towards Thomas Maree, the culprit, was that he was a right-wing fascist and he had many things in his home, Nazi memorabilia, kind of right-wing fascist literature. But the media kind of covered it to say that he was generally just had mental health issues. I bring this up because in the last 15 years, when we think about terrorism, we immediately think about
20 British potential terrorists trained in Pakistan are now back in the UK.
Mirpur in Pakistan-controlled Kashmir, an area where as many as 9 out of 10 people have a British passport or relatives in the UK. An area where militant Islamic fundamentalism is widespread.
Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria.
I don't think we've woken up to it enough. Now, I'm not going to say that it's the same level of threat as the Islamist threat. Last year's numbers, for example, 14 plots stopped last year, 10 were Islamist, 4 were extreme right wing. So no pretense that it's exactly the same order of magnitude, but it's very significant and it's growing.
And generally, when it's reported on, you know, there's no mercy given to the perpetrators. But in this instance, with Joe Cox, you know, the fact that she died was treated with the right amount of compassion and empathy, but the investigation into the culprit and the coverage by our news media was severely lacking. Now then, Thomas Maree was a white supremacist fascist who had a long history of, you know, having sectarian beliefs, and he was inspired by David Copeland. Now then, back in 1999, over 13 days, Copeland planted 3 nail bombs in London, targeting black people, Asian people, and finally gay people. 3 died, and more than 140 people lost limbs. Our interest in terrorism that goes on and perpetrated by those with brown faces is far more extensive. I bet you could name at least one of the terrorists from any of the last terrorist attacks since the 7/7 bombings. And I bet most people couldn't name Thomas Maree before they heard me say it. Before I looked it up, I couldn't remember. That's how much coverage that has got. Now then, over the last 20 years, the public's trust in the media has waned, and not just in the media, in politicians and the establishment in general. Now, you could kind of mark this back to probably 1997, after the death of Diana, when obviously the Queen, there was calls for the Queen to come out and, you know, greet the mourning public. And she did in the end, but it wasn't following royal protocol. But ever since then, you've had numerous other things that have added to this distrust within, especially the media. So you had Diana, you had in the Iraq War in 2003, then you had the expenses scandal, then you had the 2008 crash, then you had the whole Leveson inquiry with the phone hacking and the shutting down of the News of the World. And to top it off, you had Jimmy Savile and his whole sex abuse within the BBC and all those other TV celebrities of the 60s or 70s and 80s. Now, that distrust is seeded within the nation, especially within the last 10 years with the accessibleness of social media and like YouTube.
And a whole new generation of young people retreated. They turned instead to another world that was free of this hypocrisy and the corruption of politics. They went into cyberspace.
Has turned people away from the legacy media that once had a captive audience and most people talked about what they watched every week, to where now everyone has their own individualized preferences.
The agent's model of what you are interested in will always be a cartoon model. And in return, you will see a cartoon version of the world through the agent's eyes.
It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
And, he added, it will never be clear who they are working for.
As we all know, the way that algorithms work, they feed you what you want.
Individuals began to move, without noticing, into bubbles that isolated them from enormous amounts of other information. They only heard and saw what they liked. And the news feeds increasingly excluded anything that might challenge people's pre-existing beliefs.
So more so people are, especially younger generation, have found new mediums to get their information, and the mainstream media is falling behind somewhat. But is this having a toxic effect on the young minds? Because there has become a growing call, especially since Brexit, for a callback to British values. People say that my local area has changed and it doesn't feel English anymore.
We will rise like lions and get our empire back. The bloody Great British Empire that your bloody Labour rubbish give away to the people it belong to a load of bloody coons and wogs.
Now, these things are very ambiguous. Now, let's go to the hero of the 1970s and 80s, Enoch Powell, and see what he has to say about the English condition.
There was never such a thing as a United Kingdom citizen. Unlike the United States, which has its own citizenship, France, Germany, we never had that. We were British subjects. We were subjects of the king or the queen, as the case might be.
Now, as you can see, the English condition is deference. Since the 17th century, when we lobbed the king's head off, and then we had Cromwell in charge, and then when he died, we all got scared and we thought, well, we'll put the son back in, we'll put Charles II in his place, because we couldn't do without our anointed leaders. That is what the English condition is, deference. And it's deference to this mythical history that, we're constantly told by these elites. Yeah, clinging to this mythical historical past with context erased and replaced with heroes that seem like angels. The relationship between the elites and the powerful and the poor has really been, non-existent up till universal suffrage. Not like the Magna Carta, as you're told in school and maybe in the news. The Magna Carta was for landowners and royalty. Universal suffrage was the vote for every man, at least, and those women of the elites after World War One, because of what they put on the line for the country. Is this language around our mythical past, and especially our victory in World War II, creating this mythos amongst a lot of white people or the indigenous white people of this country? into believing that somehow that ever since the 1970s and, you know, being part of the EU and, you know, migrations from different parts of the world have, you know, continuously been happening, have somehow affected Britain's greatness.
Much distress and hurt to me.
All right, it's time. All right, it's time.
Now with the rise of people on social media,
the umbrella of that wider racial or civilizational identity as well. Obviously, our enemies try to posit one against the other and break down identity and play all these psychological games, all these word games. But how has that blossomed in you? How have you come to better understand and articulate what unites us worldwide?
What you've seen alongside that since the Iraq War, Afghanistan War, and the wars in Syria and Yemen and all that, you've seen a diaspora of immigrants moving across Europe, which is kind of fed into much of this kind of ethnocentric protectionism, where the news media has constantly been covering these people moving across. And then you have your agent provocateurs like Nigel Farage, Katie Hopkins, Tommy Robinson, and Sargon of Akkad, all kind of inflaming or stoking up the flames of racial tension within the country. And pre the Brexit vote, that was much of the reason why people in the end voted for Brexit, because of this fear that there was going to be a mass replacement of the the indigenous people of this country.
I just want to ask, should white people also start playing identity politics now before they become a minority themselves by 2066?
But especially after Brexit, how the internet and social media has galvanized, you know, groups like, you know, UKIP and the EDL, or what is now Britain First, and even now there's a new organisation, the Patriotic Alternative.
I think the great thing about Patriotic Alternative is we've come out, we've been very bold, we've been very honest, we're not mincing our words. Yeah, this is racial. We don't want to become a minority in our own homeland. Britain is a white country and it should remain overwhelmingly that way.
Which a lot of these people who are on the socials are using as their hashtag or their flag for this new form of fascism, which is where they're trying to change the language. Like, one of the big words they use to try and disguise their concerns is demographics. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard it. It's been used quite a lot. It's even been mentioned on mainstream media of late.
More Democratic voters has been happening in Georgia over about 10 years now. But she says there is a lag time between demographic changes and electoral changes.
Now, a lot of these provocateurs over the last few years have tried to create this myth and this idea in the indigenous people's heads that whiteness is wrong, being white and our history, because in many cases, especially like institutions like school and university, they're making great strides or effort to recontextualize what was quite a binary history. So before, you know, we were just told about the events. Like I said, these heroes of the past were just treated with no criticism or any kind of critical thinking. But in universities and stuff, over the last 20 years, there's a lot more time been invested in the idea that, you know, things aren't just straightforward. They did A, so B, or, you know, he did this, so that was good because I said so. You know, is that things are more nuanced than that, and that's all that's occurred. But what they're attempting to do is use that to make white people feel threatened, that they're going to be challenged or criticised, and
equal rights does not entitle Nick Knox to move next door.
Feeling under threat. But the worst part is our mainstream media now also playing along with this game. Because as I said, in the last 15 years, with the distrust with the mainstream media, more people have, put their attention into, social media. Their heads are in their Black Mirror, looking at their phones and in their laptops and in their tablets. That's where all their engagement is. So the mainstream media has to compete because, it's all about money at the end of the day. So unfortunately, they these days are now leaning far more into these right-wing talking points because they are getting less money through advertising, and especially the BBC is getting less money through its license fee. And soon this government wants to eradicate the license fee so it can make the BBC more of an entity that it can manipulate and, basically be the propaganda arm of the government. But in the meantime, they have no choice in their heads or in their minds other than to kind of follow where the topics are, to be first, as they put it. Now, I'll refer you back to a comment Denzel Washington made a few years ago about the media and about information. And he said,
if you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed.
They are very good at playing the game of ambiguity. Now, it's not a new game either. In the tension of the 1970s and 1980s and the racial tensions at that time, and the indigenous peoples' fear that they were under threat, in the same way they feel now,
racists were starting to be given more and more airtime and being given more and more credibility for a variety of reasons, but mainly because they basically produce fairly controversial television.
Because it gets viewers, it gets engagement, it gets people angry.
And that, if it quotes, liberal mainstream television thought that they could contain racists, thought they could bring them in.
So then, many people may wonder, why should we worry about this? As generally, the indigenous folk in this country don't feel that way about us anymore. True, right now. But when the forces of the past are used to brainwash and disenfranchise those lower on the economic and hierarchical ladder, the libidinal forces of the in-group can be so euphoric that those higher up the ladder will lean into the tacit acceptance of the aggressions towards the perceived out-group.
Break it down!